Ancient War and Modernism. The David Jones poem we are starting today is probably the most difficult piece we're reading this semester in some ways, though I think it is also very accessible. It is a late piece compared to the others we've read. It was published in 1937, nearly 20 years after the end of the war. Remember that about 10 years after the war's end, in 1928 through 30, we had seen a great blossoming of Great War texts, partly spurred on by the success of All Quiet on the Western Front, and partly the plain result of writers having time to process their war experiences and translate them for a reading public finally willing and able to hear them. David Jones came from a family with Welsh roots, but was himself raised in London, and when he enlisted for war service, he joined a regiment made up of roughly equal Welshmen and London Cockneys. Cockney is a name for a person born and raised in central London, within the sound of Bow Bells. Like Remarque and Isaac Rosenberg, Jones was an enlisted man, so his vision of the war is distinct from that of officers like Sassoon and Owen. Jones's poem is set mostly in the part of the war before the Battle of the Somme, which began July 1, 1916. The poem begins with Private John Ball's embarkation to France with his battalion. The last section of the poem reflects an experience of the Battle of Mammoths, one of the Somme battles. Between these bookends, Jones tells the whole experience of the war, the fear, the boredom, the petty militarisms, the comradely companionship that so many soldiers remember as the only truly valuable thing to emerge from the war. In parenthesis is a modernist poem. Modernism is a movement, usually dated 1880 to 1940, that responded to social and technological changes of the early 20th century and was marked by technical experimentation and by ironic uses of literary history. Clearly, the Great War fits snugly into the time period of modernism, and the mismatch in the war between technologies of destruction and human stature and strategy is a very modernist problem. Because many poets and writers of the war nostalgically felt that the before the war period had been a time of beauty, harmony, and joy, a good many of the Great War poets resisted some of the more obvious forms of modernism, especially those that were most obviously experimental. But as you know from reading Fussell, what may have been the most modern thing about war writers was the degree to which irony held center stage in their texts. When I teach modernism, I tell my students on the first day that irony is almost always a correct answer to questions about modernism. Irony is a peculiarly modernist literary mode because it allows text to be double-voiced or more, and multiplicity, especially the insight that a single correct standpoint can't exist in times of modernity, is a key concern of modernism. Modernist writers were comfortable with the idea that readers might experience confusion in their texts, and that's why you could find Jones a bit challenging. But moderns aren't difficult just to be hard, or to make you feel stupid. Rather, modern texts can be difficult because modern writers acknowledge that the meaning of any text is made in cooperation between writers and readers. There are many implications of this thought, including that one singular correct reading is impossible. But if you struggle at all with Jones, I want you to remember that Jones trusts you to read his book. He thinks that your contribution to his text is what makes it alive and meaningful, and he welcomes your responses, including your confusion. Now, what might be confusing about Jones's text? Modern writers strongly wanted to expand the subject matters that could be included in books, including characters like John Ball, who was a regular guy and not the most natural soldier who has ever been drafted. Of course, the army would have been made up of many thousands of soldiers like Ball, because most people are not born heroes. Virginia Woolf famously said that the proper stuff of fiction should be an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. John Ball is the Great War version of that. Moderns wanted to include vernacular language, which is to say, language as it is used in the streets, not just the proper and even elevated languages that had been considered appropriate for poetry. Sassoon also valued the vernacular and taught Owen to avoid archaic, explicitly poetic language in favor of diction and rhythms that reflect the way soldiers spoke during the time of the Great War. Jones shares this value, including bountiful examples of the way people in his unit actually talk. Since about half the unit are Welsh and the other half Cockney, The poem includes snippets of the vernacular from each group. Cockneys use a peculiar and very, very cool slang called rhyming slang. This slang was developed because Cockneys were working people in London who rubbed shoulders with the rich and powerful, and sometimes it is important to conceal from the rich and powerful what you are saying about them. The way rhyming slang works is like this. Mate is the word British people would generally use to mean friend or pal. China plate rhymes with mate. Omit the plate and you have China, used throughout the poem as a stand-in for mate. Now, of course, most of us are Americans and we are probably not steeped in Cockney rhyming slang, let alone in Welsh. That's why your editors have included a helpful set of notes at the back of your volume. You will be a lot less confused if you refer to these notes frequently. Finally, the third significant modernist mode you will find in parenthesis is intertextuality. Intertextuality is a little more than allusion. It's the incorporation of other earlier texts into a new modernist one. In the case of in parenthesis, Jones uses ancient Welsh poetry, the story of King Arthur, and many other texts to help make his poem. Again, you can find out which poem is being invoked at any given moment by looking at the notes. Why does Jones do this? One reason, common among modernists, is to alter the original text by incorporating it in a modern one. That is, when T.S. Eliot invokes Hamlet in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, he is both attempting to explain his character by reference to Shakespeare's and changing the way we think of Hamlet so that we see him as a modern figure as well. Another reason to invoke older texts is to demonstrate how the world has changed. Jones often makes an implicit argument that the Great War is really just an episode in a series called War that encompasses all wars in all places and times. But by doing so in the context of the Great War, he also shows how strange the World War is in its scope, but also in the role and place of human beings within the war. Obviously, references to ancient texts you haven't read might also cause some confusion. But I encourage you to know, oh, that's the Mabinogion again, without letting yourself get bogged down in the details. I think you can just go ahead and read without being too concerned about every bit of intertextuality. There is a ton in this book, and you will get a feel for how it helps construct the book, even if you don't understand every detail. Remember, the notes at the back will definitely help, but I think if you concentrate on Private Ball and what's happening to him, you will get out of this long poem what you need for this class. For some of you, in parenthesis will be your favorite book this semester. You can take pleasure in the thought of returning to it later and teasing out all these beautiful connections. Now, irony. We don't want to forget that for an instant. In reading this text, I would be very alert for how the author uses irony. Remember, irony is a literary strategy in which a writer says two opposed things at once, or where we know something that the characters in the book do not. It's a way of putting two opposed realities into a text at the same time. Sarcasm is a form of irony. If someone asks you if you want to do something that you do not want to do, and you reply, "I can't wait," you're using irony. When you see a character in a movie walking toward a scary beast that you can see and the character cannot, and the character says, "What a lovely day, sure hope there's not a beast behind that rock," that's irony. Why would writers particularly deploy irony in writing about the Great War? We have already seen many examples of this technique as writers seek to contrast promises of honor and glory and valor with the realities of the war. For Jones, writing from the point of view of a man not really cut out for army life, irony is the best strategy for describing what the war feels like. Ball wants to do what he ought, but he is perpetually a step behind the other soldiers. In fact, our introduction to him in the first pages of the poem shows him arriving late to parade for France, sliding into line at the back, hoping to escape notice. Around him, we hear army bureaucracy. "Have that man's taken, if you please, Mr. Jenkins. Take that man's name, Sergeant Snell. Take his name, Corporal." Poor, hapless John Ball. He'll be late for the last trump, apparently, and when he settles in and feels his pack to settle it, he has already lost his mess tin cover, so he's going to be in trouble again soon. This is no glorious marching off to war. He has no illusions of heroism or even of doing his duty. He just hopes he can avoid getting into trouble, and the Army and its requirements don't seem like they're going to cooperate with that goal. Private Ball is ordinary. a regular man who finds himself in a very irregular situation. Unlike the young men of All Quiet, he doesn't seem to have ever had any illusions about warfare. You can almost imagine he's wandered into the army in the same way you might wander into a store while window shopping, not driven by any strong desires or fears, but just looking up from a daydream to find himself embarking for the trenches. Marching up to the line for the first time in Part 2, Ball regained a certain quietness and an indifference to what might be, as his loaded body moved forward unchoosingly as part of a mechanism another mile or two. No longer fully human, but instead a tiny part of a massive war-making machine, Ball represents the common soldier who fights for no cause, rather doing as he is told in hopes of avoiding the ire of his real enemy, the military hierarchy that demands compliance with its procedures. Those of you who have been in the military probably feel a great deal of sympathy for this point of view. As you read in parenthesis, look for how Jones develops Ball's character. What bits of information does he share? What linguistic or literary tricks does he deploy to help us understand Ball? And most importantly, how does understanding Ball help us understand the war? It is useful, this far along in the semester, to make connections between books. I've suggested a few ways in which his character and the book connect to the things we've read so far. What other connections can you make? And can you piece together why Jones links the Great War to ancient wars? How does he see this war as like those? How does he suggest they are different?